I want to welcome everyone tonight. My name is Mimi Zukov. I serve on the Summit Environmental Commission and the Summit Area Green Faith Circle, and those are the two organizations that are sponsoring tonight's garden talk, along with our wonderful partner, the Summit Public Library, who makes it so easy for us to deliver education to our community. So thank you to the Summit Public Library. I wanted to say a couple of things about how we're going to run the event tonight. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. We're going to have a question and answer period at the end of both presentations. And the talk tonight is being recorded, and within about a week or so, the Summit Public Library will put it on their YouTube channel, and it's available for anyone to view at any time. I wanted to also let everyone know that the Summit Environmental Commission has an amazing project that we've been working on called the Tiny Forest. It's almost 3 years old, and it's a completely native reforestation project. We used a rapid reforestation method, the Miyawaki method, and we had so many beautiful native plants and flowers last summer that we were able to collect them and provide them to the library, who had volunteers who packaged them up, and now those seeds are available in our native seed catalog for the public to take at no charge. Very, very exciting. You're all welcome to visit the Tiny Forest. It's open 24 hours a day. It's behind the Summit Recreation Center, Summit Community Center. They changed the name. And I'm happy to give tours. Anyway, so welcome to tonight's garden talk. We have two wonderful speakers. The first speaker is Tekla Pontius-Courtney, who is a working gardener. She has a master's of landscape architecture from Rutgers and owns a design build landscape company called Tek Courtney LLC, based in Maplewood. They focus on the hundreds of plants that are often missing from our everyday neighborhoods. Tekla also volunteers with the Garden Club at Columbia High School, where they have planted 2,000 native flowers. We also have Jessica Miller, who is a clothing designer by trade and a native plant geek in her time off. That's her words, not mine. She volunteers with the Native Plant Society of New Jersey and maintains a little native seed library outside of her South Orange home. She works with her local community to add native plants to their local park and school. And she's the one that taught us how to harvest the seeds. So without any further ado, I'm going to welcome Tekla to start. She's going to give a presentation about garden design, native plant garden design, and then Jessica's going to give a presentation about how to raise native plants from seed. At the end, we'll have the Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone see the screen? Good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here, and we have a lot to talk about, so I'm just going to jump right in. It's that time of year when I'm really missing my garden and being outside. But it's a great time to plan. And so here we go. We often think of plants as mysterious, never quite knowing what will work or why. It doesn't help that labels tend to claim that plants will flower forever and be perfectly happy in sun or shade, wet or dry. And so when something doesn't work, we can feel like we are the ones who messed up. One of the most overlooked aspects of plants is that plants have preferences just like us. And so it all comes down to the information we use, the conditions we think about, and the plants we choose that match those sites. I'm hoping the things you can take away from this presentation are the tools to figure out the specific site conditions of your garden and how to look for the plant information that you need. One of the hardest things to do is to figure out just what kind of site conditions you have. And for plants, this generally means the soil and light conditions. This is especially hard because the real way to do it involves reading the plants that are already there. And so you have to build up a plant knowledge of what plants tends to prefer what site and where. And it's made all the more complicated because some plants have a wide range of conditions. In order to know what's really going on, you have to look at all the plants together as a whole, and this takes time. I tend to break light conditions into slightly more categories than you'll typically find online. And this is because in residential settings, we usually have some pretty dense shade, either from nearby buildings or just other plants that have grown taller in a garden than they would in older sites with far more species and individuals. And so it's helpful to remember that some plants won't like that dense shade, even if the garden is technically 68 hours of strong direct sun. This is especially true for plants that come from more barren, sparse sites, although other plants tend to need lots of sun too. An all-day sun plant might be okay in a place that only gets 6 to 8 hours of afternoon sun, but it means you might have to put it in the front, sunniest edge of the garden so that it doesn't get shaded out by other things. These plants are the ones that tend to disappear from older gardens as other, more shade-tolerant things get bigger and fill in over time, especially for fairly rich sites. Which isn't to say that you can't ever plant all-day sun things, but rather that there are reasons they are struggling or disappearing from a site, be it the light conditions or the soil. So what do we mean when we talk about the soil conditions? This is easily one of the most understood aspects of site, and it doesn't help that the terms for soil moisture and drainage are confusing, and that even the best terms haven't really made it into the public realm yet. I find it helpful to think of each spot in terms of whether it is wet mesic, or on the drier side of things. There's another term you might come across called consistently moist that I tend to save for very rich sites, places that are soft and uncompacted with layers of decomposing organic matter. It's in quotes because we don't really have much of this left. These terms are best understood with respect to how fast water disappears from the site. A sharply drained site means water goes through it and the place becomes hot and dry in between the rains. Whereas a wet or wet mesic site holds on to its water, especially for long periods in the winter or the spring. Sometimes the shape of the land can give you a clue, but not always. This is where your plant knowledge is going to come in, because if you see a truly wet mesic plant on the side of a seemingly dry mountain, you'll have to think that maybe there's some kind of seep or reason that the water is sticking around. One of the reasons these terms are so confusing is that the vast majority of residential gardens around here are pretty solidly mesic. This means that we're so used to seeing it, we don't even realize it's a thing. And it doesn't help that mesic can only really be defined in relation to what it's not. It's not a sharply drained gravel hill, it's not a bathtub that holds water, but still it gets pretty wet when it rains. Many gardens are mesic, and if we're talking about a site that has a green lawn and shrubs that you recognize, chances are we're probably talking about a mesic site, even if it does have tendencies towards one or the other side. Reading a site is always difficult, especially because there are all sorts of nuances and things underground that you can't yet see. You're going to mess up. You'll try a range of wet mesic to dry mesic things and see what does best in your specific spot from year to year. So say you've taken a stab at guessing your site conditions, and now you need a better way to find out the site conditions of a plant. The first place you'll want to look is Illinois wildflowers. They have some of the best site descriptions out there, and there's a good chance many of the garden plants you'll be looking at are included, since we share something like 85 to 95% of our plants with Northern Illinois. Other sites might help fill in the gaps. When all else fails, check iNaturalist and try to glean anything you can from the site conditions in the photos. And for books, my two favorite books are the Tallgrass Restoration Handbook and Flora of the Chicago Region. They both talk about plants in terms of wet mesic, mesic, and dry, and give lists of plants that tend to occur with each other. So how do we know where and how to, now that we know where and how to look, we still don't know the plants that are even options. How do we start making a list? Most gardens are missing the full spectrum of different kinds of plants out there. And this is a problem because it means our neighborhoods would still be missing the very things we're trying to rebuild. It means that we still have to talk about what kinds of plants to look for as we're building our list. Because all those little things, all those overlooked plants that don't usually get planted, all those little plants are host plants in and of themselves, and we couldn't really call a garden restoration without them. If we don't plant them, we're not even beginning to approximate that which is missing in the first place. And here we notice the orange castilleja, and they're pretty special in their own right. But it's the tiny commandra that you can barely see that is really special in this spot. Even the grasses and sedges themselves are often overlooked, though they too are flowers and host plants for all sorts of little things. I can hardly believe I found this photo, and you can barely see it. But in the middle, there is a flower fly visiting a grass flower. We don't usually think of grasses as flowers, nor that they too have a place. And so we should try to pick plants from each plant functional group, each type of plant out there, and all that it does. For graminoids, this means planting both cool season grasses, warm season grasses, and sedges. If I did my garden over again, I'd start with as many sedges as I thought matched my site. Here, the dappled sedge is Carex radiata, but it's really the fuzzy silver-green grass on the right, Bromus calmii, that is really special. It's easy to only plant the flashy things, the things for people, while missing all the little textures that make up the very sites we are trying to mimic. There are also a number of forbs that are typically not included in gardens, and yet each has a role to play. The hemiparasitic plants in particular are almost always missing, as well as the oddball things like figworts. Even the Virginia strawberry, so often a part of the very remnants we are trying to rebuild, are missing from most gardens. Prairie Moon is a good place to browse, even if only to look at the pictures. They have a wider range of plant types available than just about anywhere else. One of the best things we can do as we work on a garden is ask ourselves, what's missing? And so I tend to tackle things by plant type, whether it's the figworts, the eutrochiums or jopies, the anthenarias, the anemone virginianas in which the skippers sleep, the conoclinium, the carrot family things, the Ohio spiderworts, some of the legumes in which the leafcutter bees enjoy, or the really tiny things like the gallium that we would normally never even notice. We can do flashier things like the filipendula, or tiny little things that we thought were weeds. Every year is different. Some years the bromus is behind, and other years I let it come to the front. Some years I do carrot family things, and other years I do a bunch of milkweeds. And this one I wanted to end with because it's a story about a management plan. I used to always pull it up from the front edge, but then I learned that a little boy down the street liked to pass it by and look for the fairies inside the pods, waiting for them to fly away. And so now I always leave a little bit by the sidewalk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tekla. Jessica, would you like to speak now?
Sure.
Tekla, you can stop sharing your screen.
Hi. So just to start, for those of you who do not live in Summit and are lucky enough to have a seed library at your library, I have a seed library that I maintain as like a little library in front of my house, and I'm in South Orange at 87 Hickson Place. So you can visit, and some of you, for those of you who have been there, these are sort of what the little packets look like. And there's an outpost at the Glen Ridge Library too. So I enjoy teaching winter sowing because I want people to understand how easy it can be to grow these plants from seed and add them to your yard. I think sometimes sourcing plant material can be so overwhelming, you know, and it's kind of freeing to know that you can get this little packet of seeds and fill your garden. So tonight we'll talk about winter sowing. Most native plant seeds need a period of cold, moist stratification to germinate. Cold stratification equals cold plus wet, or as nature likes to call it, winter. Because these plants have evolved here, they're adapted to our seasons. We're not concerned with things like the first frost and last frost dates. We're not worried about grow lights and greenhouses and days till harvest and spring sowing. Those are all terms that are used in gardening for tropical plants that we're trying to like shoehorn into our warm seasons. Native perennial seeds tend to mature in the summer and fall, yet they don't germinate until the following spring. This is because of a process called stratification. Stratification is like the key that's needed to signal to the seed that it's time to germinate, because we don't want them germinating right in the fall when it could get cold and it wouldn't get a chance to get growing. So it's a protective mechanism to tell the seed to remain dormant until warmer and wetter weather is available. These methods have been developed by propagators through trial and error, right? So you might go to one source. Oftentimes I go to Toadshade Wildflower Farm. She has a lot of great stratification information, and Tekla also mentioned Prairie Moon. They also have great stratification information. And actually, if you order seeds from them, their catalog has a whole list of stratification codes. So I just want to list off a couple of those stratification codes that you're going to come into contact with. I talked about cold stratification, so that's cold plus wet. That's usually an average temperature of 40 degrees. So, and so you don't have to worry, it's not necessarily freezing. Some seeds have a more complex stratification process that could be like 60 to 90 days of cold stratification, 60 to 90 days of warm stratification. I tend to buy the plant for those. Those are a little tricky. Some seeds require scarification, and I pulled out an example. A lot of the pea family, this is blue false indigo, so the Baptisia. And the pea family, generally things with a harder seed coat, like scarification. So this is sort of easy. So I would take these seeds and I would put them on a piece of sandpaper. And I would take another piece of sandpaper and just rub them. And basically what that's doing is it's just sort of nicking the seed coat so that water can get in. So speaking of pea family seeds, they have sort of special requirements. They don't need much cold moist stratification, but they also they need something called a rhizobium inoculant. And that's a bacteria that's found growing on the roots of existing plants. So if you had a seed, like if you had this Baptisia seed and you knew where some Baptisia was growing, you could just go and grab a pinch of garden soil and add that in with your seeds. You could take a chance that you know it's there. If you're ordering from a nursery, they're probably gonna give you a little packet of that inoculant. Some seeds need light to germinate. Generally, when sowing seeds, you want to sow a seed to the depth that's equal to its diameter, right? So a tiny seed sits right on the surface. You think about an acorn, it's about a ½ inch wide, ½ inch down. So it's a good rule of thumb, and generally the smaller the seed, you need light to germinate and you want to be right at the surface. Some seeds benefit from soaking. So like a larger, drier, or a larger seed or with a harder seed coat, you can pour boiling water over it, let it soak for 24 hours before you begin. Some seeds need fire to germinate. Here again, that's one where I buy the plant. You know, like some pine cones need fire for the resin to open up the seeds. So I usually teach this where I talk about winter sowing, but we happen to be in the end of February. So I'm going to first start with how to replicate this winter process in your fridge. So I mentioned that 40 degrees is sort of the ideal temperature. And so this is done by placing your seeds in the fridge, not the freezer. I pulled out these, this is a violet variety pack. And it needs, let's see, 60 days cold stratification. So I would start here. Generally, like the smaller seeds come in these little packets. And this is a coffee filter. And I would just put my seeds in the coffee filter and fold it up. And then I put it in a Ziploc bag. And then I grab my water, which is right over here, sorry. And I just want enough just to wet that coffee filter. It doesn't need to be soaking. And so that's thoroughly moistened. And then I pulled these out of the fridge, right? I think the next thing you're going to do is label it appropriately. Like this is a sedge that I just pulled out of my fridge today. And I made a note that it needs cold stratification for 60 days. I made a note of the date that I put it in the fridge. And then I labeled it, looks like with the common name and the binomial name. And after I put that in my fridge, I set a date, I set a reminder in my Google Calendar so that I get a pop-up notification when they're done. It's always fun to get a notification that your seeds have been stratified. If I had a large batch of seeds that I wanted to do and I didn't want to do, I could mix them with damp sand and put them in here. Put them in a baggie, or I could put them with sand in a container, put the lid on, label it, put it in the fridge for the amount of time. When they're ready, when they're done, at this point, you'll be ready to sow when they're done. I like to germinate things in these 4-inch pots. So I would sow them into these pots. It's trial and error to know what your germination rate is per species. I generally, for Forbes, I like to put 5 plants per pot. But sometimes what I do, so you could put them like milkweeds oftentimes, right? If I've done the milkweed seeds, I like to do 1 in each corner and 1 in the center. And that, I think that gives you a nice pot of plants. And they tend to all germinate. The other thing you could do, some people like to do this winter sowing, the milk jug method. I like to sow, and that creates like a tiny little greenhouse. I like to use these lettuce containers. And I sow really densely in here. And I pulled this one out because I saw that it just started to pop. They're not all germinated yet. So when I sow densely in here, first comes the first 2 leaves, which are called the cotyledons, right? They're just sort of like a little satellite dish that's sending up for photosynthesis. That's where these are right now. The next set of leaves that come up are the first true leaves. And so when those first true leaves come up, this will look like a carpet of green, and I'll have a bunch of sprouts. And I would, at that point, I'll show you on these, though they're not quite ready yet. I would start to tease them out. Like this one is ready. I don't even know if you can see, I have a little bitty sprout. and I would put it in a pot. And then I use this really sophisticated garden tool called a chopstick. And I would use that to just sort of tuck the root into the soil. And that's how I would transfer my plants. So next I'm going to talk about winter sowing. I suppose I should also mention, once you finish stratifying, you could direct sow. You could go out to your garden, and because you're all wonderful native gardeners, you've left your leaves. So you're going to peel your leaf litter back a little bit, and you're going to take your seeds and you're going to press them into the garden soil, and you're going to put the leaf litter back and let them germinate in place in the ground. That's fine too. If you're winter sowing, that's the exact same process you're going to use, right? You could go and you could direct sow right into your yard. And I like to do that when things like when the seeds are ripening and I think, oh, I'd like that somewhere else in my yard. I just take those seeds and go tuck it somewhere else for next year and likely forget about it and have a nice surprise in the spring. I also, when I winter sow and I have my little packets of seeds, I like to say the sweet spot is Thanksgiving to New Year's. And I sow my seeds. That's where these came from, right? I sow my seeds on top of about an inch of dirt. I have a label in here that tells me what it is. I also have labeled it on the top. And then I just wet it. I don't want it overly damp. Sometimes I put holes in the bottom. I don't always. And then I just put these outside and let them sit over the winter. And that stratifies them outside. And then as things warm up, this creates a little greenhouse. I don't keep them in the sun because I don't want them frying. I'm keeping them in a shady place. And even once, and then I've shown you, once I've grown them in here and they begin to sprout, I transfer them to my pots and I leave them in the shade. I don't want to put them directly in the sun, right? A little sprout can dry out quickly and it can fry quickly. So I sort of keep them in the shade until they're well established, and then I'd start introducing them to more sun. And then they all sit in my driveway all summer, and when people come by my house, I hand out plants. So because you'll have, that's the other thing about this process, is you'll end up with probably more than you know what to do with, and then you'll have to find a local community garden to send the plants to live at. So, I did want to mention 2 resources, and I sent Mimi the links so that she can share them all with you. One is this Going Native brochure, and it's a great quick list of things to add to your yard. Certainly, these are a little more of the common species, not the ones you're going to get from Tekla, because she is a genius amongst us and knows about all of the rare plants that we don't all know about. But my favorite part of this is on the back, there's this resource Jersey Yards. And we're really fortunate in New Jersey that they have this searchable plant database. And so you can put in your planting criteria and it's generating a list for you that's native to New Jersey. And you can even put in your eco-region, because New Jersey has so many different eco-regions. And another wonderful little book, this, you can download it for free or you could purchase it. And this is Native Plants for the Small Yard, and it's written by Kate Brandis. And I love it because I live in sort of a small, like on a smaller lot, suburban yard. And it has these wonderful garden plans. I mean, it even has as small as like pots that you can put on your balcony. It has a little planting plan for planting around your mailbox. So if you need some ideas for different little spaces, I think it's a great place to start. So, thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I didn't realize, Jessica, you just sent them to me.
Oh, I didn't.
So
Yeah, I thought maybe you doled them
I'm
out so it wouldn't be premature.
I'm gonna put them out on the chat to everyone, and then I will start the Q&A.
And you know what? I actually realized I forgot the most important thing, which I often forget. You have to label. You have to label, label, label. When you put it in your yard, I have noticed I use these a lot, these little plastic labels, but the squirrels like to take them away, I think. But also a Sharpie will never last on here. And this is another magical tool. It's a pencil. And so you're going to write on the plastic with your pencil, and that's not going to go away. Somehow it lasts. It seems to defy logic. I've had people share with me that they've used like old Venetian blinds to make little garden labels, or people cutting up yogurt containers to write on. These are kind of my new favorite. I just buy these in bulk, and somehow they seem to sit in the ground and don't get carried away by the critters. And yeah, that's very important, right? To label everything you put in the fridge, label whatever you sow, label your pots so that you know what you're dealing with, because little tiny seedlings can be very difficult to identify.
Those are very good suggestions. And if you think you're going to remember, you won't. So Jessica's point is well taken. And the first year I put in native plants in my garden, I labeled them all with Sharpie. And by the time the winter was over, all those labels were blank. So I did not know you could use, I did not know you could use a pencil. You can also get a garden marker, and they're supposed to be permanent.
Once something becomes part of the permanent collection, then I use these aluminum ones. And yeah, the garden marker, it's a paint marker. So if you're looking at, there are some that are marketed as garden markers, but also if you just look up like a acrylic paint marker, that'll get you. Those will last.
Very good. Thank you so much, Jessica. So I have a first question for Tekla. Tekla, if someone is starting from absolute scratch, how would you recommend they proceed? You're muted. Tekla, you need to unmute.
Sorry about that. Hi. Sorry. So from absolute scratch, I always start small. So you want to be able to weed your garden really well and be there every day. So even if it's 2 by 3 feet, it's better to start small than go really big and get overwhelmed and the weeds take over. The best kind of weeding is the weeding you can do with a coffee cup and one hand in the morning. And the more often you do the weeding, the better it's going to be. It's not going to be really work that way. The bad weeds are the ones in which you have to put the coffee cup down and grab an implement. And the really bad ones are the ones you have to physically chip away at and dig out with a pickaxe.
And why is weeding so important?
Weeding is so important because you don't want it to get it into something you want to keep. And so at some point, if you let it go, not only is it more work, but it will get into something. And in order to get the weed out, now you have to lose the thing it's in.
And they also, oftentimes, weeds are very tenacious and they outcompete the new plants you're putting in. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I also want to make a plug for the Great Swamp Watershed Association Native Plant Sale, which opens on April 1st. They are having all kinds of kits again this year for all different conditions. So it's a great place to start. They sell plugs, which are small plants, but they have 5-inch roots, and you put them in this year, and usually by the next season, you really have a plant. They're very good quality, very, very inexpensive, and I highly recommend it. Okay, so let's see what we've got. Okay. Vicki asked, does your, I'm not, Vicki, please unmute yourself if I don't get your question right. Does the garden reseed itself, or do you replant or reseed it every year? Is that your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
It's a little bit of both. So I tend to add new things every year. It took me years just to work through about 150 different plants. And so every year I'd add a couple new things. And some of them are annuals or biennials that have to be reseeded every year. And if you want to keep them around, you need new bare ground. Otherwise they tend to disappear. And so I tend to use some of the front areas, the sunniest areas, and make new ground every year just so that I can have those annuals and biennials again. Otherwise I'd lose them. And yeah, so it's a little bit of both.
Where's the dog?
Okay, and somebody asked about
She's already
the,
at Susan's? Okay, I'm on a Zoom.
can you please mute? Somebody asked about a little bit more information about the Summit Library's seed catalog. So it's an honor system. We request that you take no more than 3 seed packets a year, and that when your garden grows and you have success, that you donate seeds back to the library. And that would require you to label anything you donate, but you don't have to do it fancy. You could just put it in a paper bag with a label of what it is, and preferably its Latin name as well as its common name, and drop it off at the front desk, and they will take it to the people who package up the seeds with the labels that explain the planting conditions and so on. It's not limited to Summit residents, and you do not need a library card to participate. Okay, somebody asked, this is for Jessica, have you had any success with starting seeds of natives in containers outside after frost?
You mean sowing them after the winter has passed? Is that the question?
Valerie, do you want to clarify, please?
I can just, so there are certain species that when you look, I actually, that's one of the really fun things about the Prairie Moon catalog, is that you can go through, because there's a seed code called A in their book, and that means no pre-treatment necessary. So it is fun to just scan and find the species that are good for that. And one of those is bottle brush grass. That's a really fun one. I think the Monardas also don't need pre-treatment. So that's something that you can, that you could sow now. And a lot of the pea family ones only need 10 days. And I know that Tekla and I have played experiments with partridge pea. You know, give it 10 days in the fridge or not at all. And I think a lot of these stratification codes really have been written by those in the business who have tested out just to get the greatest germination rate. I think there was a great article, I wish I had the resource for it, that plants produce different types of seeds, and some of those seeds germinate right away, and some of those seeds will stay dormant for longer periods of time, and it's just to increase the success rates. So those stratification codes are really sort of tips for increasing your germination rates. Like I think even coneflower, you'll get some germination, probably not as much as if you had stratified it. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question.
Okay, so Tekla, somebody's asking if they can get a copy of your slides. If you want to provide that to Robin Carroll, the librarian,
Absolutely.
she can send it out to everyone that's been on the call.
Sure.
And let's see, somebody asked, are there any natives that can be invasive?
You want this one, Tekla?
Up to you. I'll take it first and then you do it. Technically we don't want to use the term invasive for things that are local. And by local, we mean something that's been around for thousands of years. In terms of the Ice Age, you know, if the conditions we're used to have been here about 8,000 or 9,000 years, I believe, you know, the plant communities we're used to in the long run of things are very new, but it's still new in terms of thousands of years. And we've moved a lot of plants around, including plants that are on this continent that have now a bigger spread than they used to even just a couple hundred years ago. But we've always done that and we always will do that. The difference perhaps now is that we've moved plants from all over the world very, very quickly in just a couple decades or a couple years. And so we tend to try to reserve the word invasive for the ones that we just brought over, the ones that we just introduced. And in truth, the vast majority of the things that we've moved around never really become invasive. They're just kind of weedy, ballast plants that came in on the ships or what have you in somebody's shoe. And most of them don't become invasive. They just kind of become part of the surrounds. But we keep the term invasive for the ones that are taking over a lot of space and kind of kicking out the other things, so that you go from a place that used to have 400 or 500 different species in a very small area, and now it's just one.
I was just going to add that native plants can be aggressive, but not invasive, just by definition. And I was at a few of us were at a garden tour in the fall, and the host was saying that her favorite thing to do with an aggressive native is to pair it with more aggressive natives and just sort of let them do their thing. So I like to think about, like, kind of bring it on instead of being scared of these things that will take over.
I would like to add that I put golden ragwort in my garden the first summer, the first year that we had the native plant sale, and it's very, very aggressive, and it's taken over my garden. So you do have to be careful, and that only happens in the sun. The ones I planted in the shade are lovely. So you do have to really pay attention to what you're planting and start slow. I started with 8 plants. I now have thousands.
I have one more thing to say to that, actually. It's a good point that the management of it is really important. And like the common milkweed is usually considered an aggressive native plant. But if you essentially attempt eradication every few years and you knock it back and you try to dig out every single rhizome that you can find, the next year it'll probably be smaller and shorter. And so there's a way to kind of knock things back just from watching it over time and making decisions about what's increasing or decreasing, what's going to take over something else that you only have 1 or 2 of. So now you need to pull out some of the things that are more common so that you don't lose those other ones.
Okay, so somebody posted that the Master Gardeners of Union County have a plant sale that includes native plants. The sale is at the Watchung Reservation on May 19th, down the hill from the Trailside Science and Nature Center. Okay, somebody asked, would it make sense to combine plants placed by seeding and native plants purchased from nurseries like Great Swamp Nurseries?
I do that all the time, and because there are things you can only get from seed, and there are things that I tend to pick as plugs just because the amount of seed to either reasonably get something is practically the cost of a plant, or it would just take so long to germinate that I kind of skip ahead, because a plant from seed could potentially take 3 years before it flowers, and sometimes even longer depending on what it is. And so I always make decisions based on price, based on what I want to happen and how fast, and what is available.
Just wanted to add something that I learned from Tekla, and that's if you're adding something from plug, or say something that you've grown from seed that's small and in a pot, is to make sure that you're creating a space around it where it can actually get sun, and you can't just like plant it beneath a bunch of tall ironweeds or something and expect it to thrive. So creating that space when you do put something small in, I think, is important.
Somebody asked, what are your thoughts on native hybrids?
I'll take that first, and then Jess, you can. So the interesting thing about plants is that they are always hybridizing. It's usually within the same genus, so it's species that pretty much look very similar and they're very close to each other, but they're constantly hybridizing, and it's just what plants do. And plants are constantly reproducing vegetatively, which means they're essentially clones. They're the same individual, but they're huge or they're spread out. And there's all sorts of kind of tips and tricks to try to figure out how many are the clones and how many are actually different individuals. But in and of itself, hybrids and clones are not bad. What we've instead done is the entire landscape tends to be planted with just one individual in the horticultural trade. And that's the problem. So the fact that there's a clone or a hybrid in and of itself is not the problem. The problem is that most of our landscape is planted with just one individual.
I'm a little curious if the question is maybe getting at a cultivar as well.
I think so.
Yeah, and I think Tekla touched on that in that they're not genetic individuals. I would say that some of the hybrids also are taking species that are not native to the area and hybridizing them with something that may be native. And so I think you know, I try to go with straight species that are native to our area. I give them preference for sure. I think that there are sometimes that a hybrid that or a cultivar that makes sense. Like if you don't have room for an 8-foot tall Joe Pye weed and you're doing the little Joe, you know, maybe that's an occasion because you can make that happen in your yard. And sorry, I lost my thought after that.
I would add that one of the issues with cultivars is whether they're still going to support that native insect in its life cycle, which is a major reason that we do native planting, is to assist the insects and the other kinds of creatures that help us with our ecosystem.
I realized my thought was to throw in, and to what you were saying, is the Mount Cuba Center. Now they don't have time to study every species, but they do test beds, and it's a 5-year process for them to test everything. But they do plant straight species, and then they do a cultivar, and they do like they did a hydrangea test, and they did a sedge study, and they actually do witness what birds and pollinators are visiting them and compare them. So there is like scientific evidence for some species, and so it is something that's fun to look up. And you know, not all cultivars are created the same. Some of them are just a natural variant that somebody has named. Like I think there's a golden columbine that's just a variant of the same species.
And I have one other question. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I was wondering about both of yours feelings and thoughts about the idea that our zone, our gardening zone, has been upgraded. So we used to be 6B, now we're 7A, which is basically means that it's warmer here than it used to be, and that our local climate has changed as a result of climate change. And I personally wonder a little bit about natural cold stratification. Like this winter, we haven't had much cold. And I just was wondering if you had any thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, I don't plant according to zone. I don't use the zones for any of the plants. And that's mostly because I'm planting according to the range of that plant, and that's just the documented recent range of the past couple 100 years of that plant, which I try to stick to. It's not perfect. There's still so much out there that we don't know, and things move around. Plants have always moved. But so I tend to not pay attention to the zones at all. The zones are really more of the horticultural, agricultural kind of thing. And so from a plant perspective, I'm not personally too worried about it, because plants tend to have a fairly wide range of tolerances anyway. And so one slight little adjustment is not big. And then, we can get into talks about what it's doing for the kind of the whole connected part of it, which I'm not really qualified to talk about in terms of, what it could do for all the things that need it. And bloom times, and in the long-term scheme of things, there's all sorts of questions about that. But from the plant itself, in terms of what plant can live here, I'd say there's not much change.
That's very reassuring. Thank you, Tekla. Okay, we have another question. The best time of year to plant natives?
My preference is the fall. I think that especially when you're talking about planting a plant, because it allows it to settle in, and it allows the roots to grow without all of the stresses of the heat. And well, I love to fall plant period, but especially for like trees and shrubs. Yeah, you're getting it nicely settled in, and come spring, you're really going to thank yourself.
Yeah, I like really cold weather. So basically, if it's warm enough for us to be comfortable, it's already too hot for the plant. So 45 degrees is perfect for the plant. You can move a plant, you can move a perennial in 45 degrees, water it once, it's not going to even notice if it's, if you're doing it in February or early March. But 45 degrees is miserable for us, especially if you get your hands wet. So ideally, you're really planting when it's uncomfortable for the people. And the colder and the earlier the better, whether that's the fall going into the winter or the actual kind of end of winter, early spring.
There's another question. Can you move daffodils now before they flower, but when they first start sprouting?
Yeah, probably. The key with moving things is to get far more dirt. I think so. Jess and I just hit on trying to describe it as digging out a pot. So you're essentially trying to dig out a pot shape of soil around and under the plant. What tends to happen when people try to move a plant is they tend to kind of leverage it out and yank it out, and you end up with just roots. And that's a pretty much guaranteed way to either make the plant struggle or outright kill the plant. And so you really want to take that shovel and go straight down all the way around the shovel, like you're like circling a plate, just straight down. And then after you've cut all the way around with the shovel, then you leverage it out from underneath. So if you do that with any kind of plant, as long as it doesn't have a taproot, you can pretty much move anything.
Okay, and somebody else asked, can each speaker pick 2 of their favorite natives? That's a tough question.
I tend to like the little tiny things. I think one of my favorites are figworts because they're these tiny little balls of flowers, but they're like this cup of life that fills with nectar really fast. And so it's beloved by all the tiny little things. It's really easy to grow, especially the more common one, which is, I think, Scrophularia marylandica. And it's beloved by all the very little things and kind of unusual.
Okay, I'm going to give you 3 actually. My first is Trillium because I only have one established plant in my yard, so that's like my sought after plant, right? And the next is Jacob's Ladder, because it blooms early in the spring, and then it has like this beautiful, and it handles shade, and it has this beautiful foliage that persists through the rest of the season. So I think it's kind of perfect. And another perfect plant to me is Itea, is it Virginica or Virginiana? The Virginia Sweet Spire, because it blooms early and it has white blooms that almost look like a dreadlock or something. And but then come fall, the leaves turn like rainbow colors and generally settle into like a maroon and purple, and they persist for well past November. So yeah, they're a pretty beautiful plant.
Jess, I wanted to ask you, where do you keep the salad containers? You keep them how cold?
Yeah, something I didn't go into because sometimes I teach seed sowing in a 2-hour time slot too. So there's a big thing about rodent protection, right? They stay a little safe in the salad containers, but I keep them on my screen porch, which keeps them pretty safe. But if I was able to, if I didn't have dogs, I'd keep them out in the yard and let them get snow on top of them, because I do think snow is a magic ingredient. But if you're doing open pots, then you have to think about putting mesh over them to keep the critters out. And squirrels don't always, I don't worry about things taking the seeds. It's more the squirrels that are curious and they tossle the soil and tip the pots. Yeah.
Yeah. And what about for full sun seedlings that are now in the shade? Do you find they get really leggy?
I have some Pearly Everlasting that I just found had sprouted, and yeah, it looks a little leggy, so I will move it to, in fact, they might fail, they're so leggy. So I am going to increase the sun on those. Generally things are germinating all at once, and so as soon as they pop, I'd start to give them a little more sun. Yeah, and I do find that the things that prefer drier don't like that little greenhouse thing. I think it's too moist for them, and they prefer more open pots.
Yeah.
Okay, we have one more question, then we're going to have to stop. What plant species are ideal for attracting native bees?
I'm going to say rattlesnake master.
That is a nice one. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the mint things have really good sources of nectar, those figworts we mentioned. And really, you just want many different sizes of flowers, many different timings of the blooms. You're trying to get a full set of things in. I didn't mention that most flowers only flower for 2 to 3 weeks, which means you need a whole set of flowers if you're going to have something flowering throughout the year. And if you're going to have multiple things flowering, you need even more. And that's really the key, to always have that source of food for little things. And, you know, we didn't go into the management of sites. There's so much to talk about, but the way you manage the site is also going to affect the tiny little things that are there. And it can take years for things to come in. So if you were to clear all the brush constantly or do a prescribed burn of absolutely everything, you'd be killing everything that was above ground. And so it's always good to leave some of the old vegetation up and take some of the old vegetation away, because you're trying to balance between those little things that are trying to overwinter there and aren't going to come out until August, versus the things that the plants need, and the plants don't want to get shaded out by their old foliage. So it's always a balancing of the management system that's going to also affect the native bees.
I might also just give a shout out for habitat for when they're nesting, because our native bees, they don't keep hives. They're not honeybees. They're mostly solitary bees. So little areas of bare ground are needed. And also think about when you're cutting things back and leaving like an 18-inch stem if you are cutting back. Because those little hollow places are places where they tuck their eggs, and so it also thinking about that overwintering and having them be on site.
Well, I want to thank our speakers tonight. Thank you so much. I do want to say that I actually met Tekla and Jessica through the Native Plant Society of Essex County. I don't believe we have one for Union County yet, but we're always welcome at the other counties, and it's a great way to meet people and to learn things. The website is terrific. You might consider, if you're interested in native plants, of joining the Native Plant Society to support the work that they're doing. It's really, really wonderful and very educational. And they also just published a guide for setting up native plant gardens at schools with all the details of how to go about it. So I highly recommend all of that. We will do our best to send out Tekla slides, and also the list of the resources. And I want to thank everyone so much for coming. Again, if you are interested in visiting the tiny forest, you can always reach out to us on the Summit New Jersey Environmental Commission Facebook page and leave us a message if you want to reach us, and we will be happy to set up a tour. So thank you so much to everybody for coming.
Mimi, I see somebody's asking about the school guide, and that can be found on the Native Plant Society website. You can request a copy there.
Thank you. I didn't see that. Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. It was a lovely evening, and we've all learned so much. So best of luck in your spring gardening, and let's all keep up this really wonderful work we're doing to support our ecosystem. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for speaking.